They never expect you to walk away without a sound. They anticipate tears, turmoil, explanations, and emotional explosions they can consume. But when you give them nothing, no response, no argument, no final dramatic goodbye, you instantly transform into their greatest fear. Because silence isn't emptiness, it's a form of strength. And today, I'm going to show you exactly why. The quiet departure, the one they never imagined you could make, is the very move that forces them to crawl back, desperate to reopen a door you've already locked. If this already strikes something inside you, pause for a moment and recognize it, because grasping this truth is the first real step in breaking their cycle forever. Narcissists don't seek closure the way emotionally healthy individuals do. Closure for them is meaningless because relationships aren't actual emotional bonds. They're mechanisms of control. Their entire psychological design centers around maintaining dominance through attention, reaction, and emotional access. They live on the certainty that they can sway your emotional state, whether through approval or conflict. Even arguments serve them because conflict still keeps you involved, still keeps you responding, still traps you within their emotional grid. So when you choose silence, you aren't merely withholding words, you're tearing down the foundation they stand on. You create a break in the routine, a disruption in the emotional circuitry they depend on. A narcissist expects one thing consistently: your emotional responsiveness. They expect explanations, debates, tears, pleas for understanding, or at least some signal that reminds them they still matter enough to affect you. Silence gives them absolutely none of this. It interrupts the familiar script they continuously run with you. Instead of viewing you as an emotional resource that remains available, they suddenly encounter a void where their control once operated. And because they don't process emotions in a reflective or relational way, that void feels like danger, not like a learning moment. Once you step out of their emotional battlefield, the narcissist's sense of superiority begins to wobble. They aren't thinking about how you feel. They're fixated on what they've lost access to. They don't miss the relationship itself. They miss the influence they held within it. Silence robs them of the ability to twist your words, reinterpret your intentions, or use your emotional reactions as fuel. It leaves them unable to rewrite the story to protect their ego. Without your voice, they can't craft the narrative. Without your reaction, they can't sustain the illusion of dominance. Your silence exposes something they work endlessly to conceal: their dependency on your engagement. It reveals that the power dynamic they thought they controlled was never as secure as they pretended. It forces them to face the reality that their dominance was always tied to your willingness to respond. When a narcissist is cut off from their emotional supply, something significant begins to crack beneath the surface. The internal panic they spend their lives avoiding starts leaking through. Silent closure doesn't simply inconvenience them, it destabilizes them entirely. They are wired to require a continuous flow of validation, attention, and emotional energy from the people around them, because without it, their sense of identity becomes shaky and fractured. They don't have an internal source of self-worth the way emotionally grounded people do. Their identity is externally formed, built from reactions, admiration, fear, conflict, or emotional energy from others. So when you cut off that supply through silence, you're not just ignoring them, you're severing their psychological power line. It's like unplugging a machine that needs nonstop electricity. Everything inside them starts malfunctioning. They try all their usual tactics, provoking, guilt tripping, baiting, love bombing, causing drama, anything to restore the old dynamic. But when none of it works, the narcissist enters a kind of emotional withdrawal they have no tools to handle. Silence creates a vacuum, and in that empty space, they're left facing their own inner hollowness. It's a feeling they'll do almost anything to escape. Your silence forces them into unfamiliar emotional terrain. Instead of reacting to your emotions, they're pushed into confronting their own, and that is exactly where their panic begins. They start questioning why their tactics no longer work. They wonder whether you've moved on, whether you've grown stronger, or whether someone else has taken their place. All of these possibilities shake the core of their inflated ego. This is why they often return urgently, not out of love, not out of guilt, but out of sheer psychological necessity. They need to regulate themselves again by gaining access to you. The panic isn't about losing you, it's about losing the control, losing the energy source, and losing the mirror that reflected their desired version of themselves. Narcissists can endure anger, accusations, debates, even emotional meltdowns, because all of that keeps you connected to them. What they cannot endure is indifference. Indifference is the one emotional state they have no strategy for. When they expect confrontation and instead receive silence, they become psychologically stripped of their defenses. Their entire relational strategy revolves around emotional activation. They expect you to react, defend your position, search for answers, or try to mend the bond. That expectation gives them a sense of dominance because as long as you're reacting, they can twist the narrative, control the meaning, and position themselves above you. When you give no reaction at all, you remove the stage they depend on. Narcissists interpret silence as a mix of abandonment and humiliation. It signals you've stepped out of the role they constructed for you. They feel exposed because without your participation, they can't stabilize their insecurity. They can't displace blame. They can't rewrite the story to make themselves the victim or the hero. And they can't trap you back into familiar emotional cycles that empower them. Your silence becomes a boundary they never approved. And because they rely on dominance, this boundary feels like an attack, even though your action is simply disengagement. Instead of reacting outwardly, they begin reacting inwardly, and that's where their deepest fears show up. They start wondering why you're not fighting, why you're not defending yourself, why you're not seeking closure or validation from them. They assume something must have shifted behind the scenes. Perhaps you've gained confidence, found clarity, or recognized your worth. All those possibilities shake them because it means their psychological control is slipping away. They interpret indifference as loss of power. And for someone whose entire identity depends on being the center of your emotional world, that loss is unbearable. The absence of your reaction builds pressure they can't relieve with their typical tactics. They don't fear your anger. They fear your neutrality. They fear your calm. They fear the version of you who no longer depends on them emotionally, because your need for them is what gave them their inflated sense of significance. Silence becomes the strongest language you can speak to someone who expects you to crumble rather than disengage. A narcissist's entire sense of power is constructed around the idea that they can influence your emotional atmosphere. They study your reactions. They push your boundaries. They learn exactly what triggers generate the biggest emotional payoff. So when you withdraw quietly, without accusations, without tears, without an emotional breakdown, you shatter the illusion they built about themselves. Your calm isn't passive, it's deeply unsettling to them. It signals that the emotional territory they once governed is no longer theirs. Silent closure exposes the emptiness behind their dominance because it removes the one thing that sustained it, your emotional participation. They have no idea how to process the end of a relationship that isn't filled with chaos. Chaos makes them feel central, needed, powerful, but your quiet withdrawal communicates that you've stopped investing in their emotional economy. You're no longer explaining, debating, negotiating, or pleading. You've simply stepped outside their game, and in doing so, you've proven that the game was only real when you agreed to play. When you leave quietly, you're not merely walking away, you're dismantling the identity they constructed in your presence. Narcissists believe they are unforgettable, untouchable, the center of your emotional world. Your silence challenges that belief without uttering a word. It creates an emotional imbalance they cannot repair with manipulation, charm, or intimidation. For the first time, they feel the weight of their own insignificance. Your calm isn't seen as peace, it's seen as threat. They begin asking themselves questions they don't know how to answer. Why are they so composed? What changed? Who are they becoming without me? These thoughts gnaw at them because your calm implies you've regained internal control, something they depend on you lacking. Once you escape their emotional maze, they lose their power source. Your silent, steady withdrawal becomes undeniable proof that their influence was never as strong as they imagined. And in their world, that truth is deeply destabilizing because it confronts a reality they avoid. Their control only lasted as long as you permitted it. What pulls a narcissist back isn't love or awakening. It's the collapse of the narrative where they stood above you. They construct entire relationships around a psychological hierarchy in which they believe they are the prize, the exception, the irreplaceable force. When you choose silent closure, you break that hierarchy without a single confrontation. You erase yourself from the script they wrote, leaving them stranded in a story with no audience, no validation, and no emotional leverage. This is the moment they feel the loss of superiority most intensely. Narcissists rely on relational control to maintain their inflated ego. They expect you to revolve around them, doubt yourself, fight for their attention, soothe their insecurities. When all of that suddenly disappears, they're forced to question not the relationship, but their dominance. Silent closure becomes a direct threat to their belief that they can always lure you back. It shows them the cycle has ended and not by their choice. Your silence becomes a symbolic shift in power. Suddenly, the narcissist feels insecure, shaken, and surprisingly inferior. They cannot accept that you've disengaged because disengagement means rejection, and rejection to a narcissist feels like psychological annihilation. They interpret it as an attack on their worth because their self-esteem is always borrowed from others. This is why they suddenly resurface with affection, interest, or claims of change. They aren't returning for healing, they're returning to reclaim the power they lost. They need to feel central again, admired again, dominant again. Their comeback is rarely about restoring something meaningful. It's about restoring their psychological position. Silent closure proves that the power they thought they possessed was never truly theirs. It was yours, lent through your involvement. And when you withdraw that involvement, their false superiority collapses. Narcissists spend their entire life avoiding themselves. They flee from introspection and accountability because looking inward reveals the fragile core they've been hiding. So when you fall silent, when you detach without emotional theatrics, You push them into the one space they fear most, their own mind. Your silence removes the noise they depended on to escape their internal emptiness. Without your reactions, emotions, explanations, or attempts to fix them, they're left confronting the raw truth they've always dodged. For someone who survives off external validation, that sudden inner quiet is suffocating. They begin feeling the heaviness of their own inadequacy, something they've projected onto you repeatedly. Your silence becomes a mirror they cannot escape. And in that reflection, they see a version of themselves they refuse to acknowledge, unregulated, hollow, unsupported. It's not clarity they feel, it's exposure. Exposure triggers extreme discomfort for a narcissist because it shatters the inflated self-image they depend on. This discomfort appears as restlessness, impulsive behavior, or desperate attempts to pull you back into engagement. They may suddenly reach out, accuse you of abandonment, or pretend to take accountability. But this isn't transformation, it's avoidance. They're trying to flee from the discomfort of sitting with themselves because doing so means facing the truth that they cannot regulate their emotions without external supply. Your silence doesn't heal them, it reveals them. It forces them to confront a loneliness they've always tried to dump onto others. And because they lack emotional maturity, they interpret that discomfort as something you caused rather than something they need to address. They aren't drawn back to you because they suddenly value you. They're drawn because they can't tolerate the emptiness that appears when your presence isn't there to distract them. Silence amplifies their inner instability. And rather than deal with it, they try to drag you back into their emotional orbit. In their world, being alone with their real self is the greatest threat because it strips away their illusion and exposes the false identity they cling to. Narcissists don't understand closure through dialogue, apologies, or emotional honesty. Those things don't affect them. What impacts them deeply, what cuts through their defenses, is the experience of loss. Not the loss of you as a person, but the loss of access, control, and psychological dominance. Silent closure becomes the most powerful message you can send because it doesn't beg, argue, or explain. It simply ends the cycle, and that finality strikes them in a place they cannot rationalize away. To a narcissist, silence means something has permanently shifted without their permission. They operate from the assumption that you will always be emotionally accessible in some way, whether for validation, argument, comfort, or conflict. But when you pull back without a single explanation, you deliver a message they can't ignore. The door is shut, and they no longer have the authority to open it. This level of boundary is devastating to them because it demonstrates a strength and clarity they never believed you would possess. Narcissists excel at rewriting endings to favor themselves. They prefer to discard you, assign blame, replace you quickly, or provoke you into reacting so they can point fingers. Silent closure denies them every one of those options. There is no dramatic ending where they feel victorious. There is no emotional outburst they can ridicule or hold against you. There is no angry message they can twist into evidence that you're unstable or still attached. Your silence blocks their ability to rewrite the ending, and that creates a psychological fracture they cannot soothe. For them, silence marks the moment they finally understand that it's over. It tells them you've detached from a place of clarity, not emotion. It communicates that you no longer view them as someone deserving emotional space in your life. And for a narcissist, being devalued by someone they once controlled is intolerable. It's the one experience they cannot manipulate into a narrative of superiority. This is why silent closure haunts them far longer than any confrontation or emotional expression ever could. Words can be dismissed, tears can be mocked, anger can be turned against you, but silence forces them to face the truth, and even more painfully, it forces them to face your strength. When a narcissist returns after you've given silent closure, it's rarely about real reconciliation. It's almost always about regaining control. On the outside, their return may look like remorse, longing, emotional awakening, or even love. But beneath that surface lies a familiar need. They're trying to restore the dynamic where they felt powerful and you felt unsure. Their pleas aren't signs of growth. They're strategic attempts to pull open the emotional doors you've sealed. When they lose access to you, they experience it not as heartbreak, but as a threat. Their identity is reinforced by knowing they can influence your emotional world whenever they choose. But when you remain silent, you strip them of that influence. You remove the emotional landscape they once ruled. So when they come back apologizing, promising change, or acting vulnerable, it's crucial to understand what's actually occurring. They're attempting to recover the version of you who used to react. Your distance disrupts their internal stability. They don't return because they've suddenly recognized your worth. They return because they've realized they're losing their grip. And for someone whose sense of self comes from external sources, losing that grip feels like losing their identity. Their attempts to reconnect often arrive wrapped in predictable patterns: love bombing, self pity, sudden emotional insight, rewritten memories, dramatic claims about transformation. But these behaviors are not evidence of change, they're tools. Tools designed to escape the discomfort your silence created. Silent closure pushes them into a moment of inner truth they cannot endure. They're no longer in control of the ending. They fear that you've evolved beyond them, healed from them, or discovered a strength they never wanted you to recognize. Their return is an effort to reverse that growth, to pull you back into the emotional cycle where they felt secure. The most difficult truth is this: their begging isn't about the future, it's about resurrecting the past dynamic. They seek access, not intimacy, influence, not connection, power, not partnership. Your silence didn't just end the relationship, it ended their ability to define you. And that loss, the loss of control over your emotional reality, is the real reason they come back.